Hello and welcome to this special interview for The Wire. Nivedita Menon is professor at the Center for Comparative Politics and Political Theory at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her latest book is Secularism as Misdirection, Critical Thought from the Global South. In this book, she argues that secularism as we define it today is not a value in itself. It is in fact compatible with diametrically opposed worlds. It's a tool of governance and one that is often used to turn attention away from values that may be more meaningful. She joins me today to talk about the book and the ideas she's laid out in it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Before we move to the misdirection that is the main thesis of your book, I wanted to ask about what you've said about the need to question and problematize the relationship between political theory and political practice. You say that what is seen as political theory largely comes from the West, and that has then been used to try and explain so-called practice in other parts of the world. What do you think a reimagined version of this relationship should look like?
Okay, that's interesting that you see it as a distinction that I'm making between political theory and political practice, because that's not the way I thought about it, but when you put it like that, it makes sense. The argument that I was making and that a lot of scholars have been making for some decades now is that theory is located. Theory is not abstract, it cannot be universal. Now these are ideas that at least from the late 20th century have begun to be challenged, but prior to that and even today, it is often assumed that what is produced as theory from the West is applicable anywhere in the globe. Not only that, there is a judgment involved. So if you think about the way societies of the global South are talked about, there's always something wanting, right? It's underdeveloped, or it's not democratic enough, or it's retarded in its retarded in its democracy. It's unable to be properly secular. So there are ways in which certain concepts that have emerged from the located history of Europe, and when I use the word location, I mean that there is a temporal element to it, a particular time and a particular space. So what was produced as universal theory came from Europe, came from the global North, and then the idea is it can be applied. So the subtitle of my book is Critical Thought from the Global South, and I'm drawing on the very many ways in which scholars of Asia, Africa, Latin America have made the point that if theory is located, then it cannot simply be applied, and that we need to look at theory that emerges from these parts of the world, which are not disconnected from the theory of the global North, that emerges from there, because for two reasons. One is that what we are calling modernity has come to all these societies. We've engaged with it. We've engaged with something called the West, whether it's China or Japan or India. There are different ways in which the West has entered our ideas and so on. That's one reason why these are not two discrete spaces. And the other reason, of course, is that what is called Western theory already has a prehistory of cultural exchanges. So if you think of Plato and Aristotle, they were first translated into Arabic from Greek, and then the European world learns of it through Latin translations of the Arabic, and so on. So the idea is to complicate these spaces and to think about how do we look at something like secularism if we don't start with the idea that secularism is XYZ, which is the way in which it has emerged from Europe.
When you talk about certain things that have been hyper-visibilized by this discourse around secularism, and one of the examples you give is of women's agency, and you take the example of India, and you talk about how it's women's agency has been used by proponents of the Hindu Rashtra today in cases like the Karnataka hijab ban and the push for a uniform civil code as the secular agenda, but what is in fact being pushed is an idea that is defined by a certain North Indian Savarna masculinist approach to Hinduism. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, and it's also extremely suddenly topical, right? Because this Independence Day on the 15th of August, the Prime Minister declared once again the need for what he called. So what is interesting now is this use of the term secular, because secular is now being used by the Hindu right to talk of uniform civil code. Maybe a day after Independence Day or 2 days after, Mohan Bhagwat wrote a column in the Indian Express where he stands up strongly for something that he calls a secular set of laws. So what is what is meant here by secularism is worth thinking about, because if you read that, or if you listen to the way in which the Uniform Civil Code is talked about, there is an assumption that uniformity is secularism. There is also an assumption that uniformity is justice, and these are two ideas that the women's movement, the feminist movement, has at least since the 80s been challenging. Right at the beginning in 1937, the women's movement, the AIWC, the All India Women's Congress, did pass a resolution calling for the Uniform Civil Code, because at that time the understanding was that the British had come and divided us, and if we have one law, we will all be equal. But by the 90s, it became very clear that the Uniform Civil Code is an agenda of the Hindu right, and the feminist movement understood what was going on, and gradually the shift came in the feminist position to accepting legal pluralism. Legal pluralism is a perfectly valid, legitimate mode of running a democracy, and legal pluralism in and of itself is not necessarily discriminatory. And similarly, a uniform code is not necessarily just or gender just, it can in fact be extremely discriminatory. Now, what is interesting in all of this is that when you look at debates around secularism, so the argument that I am making, as you say, is that they assume, these debates around secularism assume that there are certain terms which don't need to be unpacked. There's a thing called religion, and separating the state from religion is what secularism is one way of looking at secularism. That's how, for example, France looks at secularism. So it's very intriguing for me that our friends on the Hindu right, who are so concerned about they use the term decolonial and decolonizing, and in fact what Mohan Bhagwat is subscribing to in that essay, and any Hindu right argument that equates secularism with uniformity, is essentially following an old French practice. It's utterly Western. It is not at all from this region, or that distinction. I like the way you translated the distinction between global north and global south in terms of theory into theory and practice. So that has not been the practice of secularism on the subcontinent at all. So what happens is when you have debates around secularism, so the assumption of something called religion, the assumption of its separation from the state, which is apparently separate already, and the way in which secularism will be proved or disproved is almost always on the bodies of women. Whether it is the hijab ban in Karnataka, for that argument too, secular arguments were used by the Hindu right. There's a uniform. You have to wear the uniform. That's all we are saying, right? France, no signs of religious symbols in public. So it sounds very, very equal and even-handed, but as we saw, we've seen, nuns wear habits in public spaces. So what is happening is that the bodies of women become the space on which polygamy, triple talaq, there is a way in which the bodies of women become the space on which secularism is proved or disproved. Frantz Fanon wrote about this in the context of Algeria, like what, a century ago, almost, during the Algerian War of Independence, and he talks about the way in which the hike, the veiled Arab woman, how she is initially a symbol of the backwardness of the Arab race, then she becomes a symbol of the terrorist agency of the Arabs because they're carrying arms under the hikes, etc. So this is what I'm trying to trouble by arguing that what is called religion and what is called the state, they constitute each other, in the sense that the state is almost always called upon to pronounce on whether something is religious or not just in India. There's a much larger argument in the US. In the US, if you want to claim exemption from army duty on religious grounds, the state will decide whether what you're claiming is a religious practice or not. So if you say, I don't want to fight a war because my personal beliefs are against bloodshed, that doesn't count as religion. It counts as religion only if it's part of a community which claims it. And religion, by appealing to the state, gives it its authority. The state, by defining religion, constitutes it. The state will decide whether women can walk into Sabrimala shrine or not. Right? So there's a co-constitution. It's not something separate. And in this process, women are hyper-visibilized, and it becomes, they're hyper-visibilized, but justice for them is not actually on the agenda. Something else is at stake. Is it secular? Is it pro-Hindu? Is it pro-Christianity? Some other questions are actually being proved or disproved on the bodies of women. I guess that's what I'm saying.
You've titled one of your chapters "The Failed Project of Creating Hindus," and you're talking about attempts of people like V.D. Savarkar and others of claiming this homogeneous identity when none exists. You've given a bunch of examples from non-Savarna and older spiritual and religious traditions to prove that, and basically saying that Hindutva is the latest attempt in a very long history of this being done, this homogenizing approach that is failing, you say, because even today a lot of violence is required to try and push that agenda forward. What does that mean for people today in India who are trying to oppose a state-led Hindutva project?
So my sense is that and that there are two ways of challenging the Hindutva project from the space of what is called Hinduism. There's a third way. The third way would be to step outside of this space defined as religion altogether, and that is very clear. You use the constitution, you talk about citizenship, and those are very legitimate, and I've spoken about those also in my book. But there are those who would prefer to speak from the space of, so as to, in a way, say not in my name, right? It's the so-called Hindu majority wants to speak against Hindu Rashtra, and that's very clear. There is absolutely no groundswell of support for Hindu Rashtra. That is now very, very evident. At the beginning of the project, it seemed as if, and I mean from the 90s, it seemed as if it was growing, there was a groundswell. But by now, and especially after the last election, it's clear that it's electoral manipulations, electoral engineering. There's no groundswell of support. They lost Ayodhya. I mean, one has to keep saying that. So one way of challenging, and I've talked about that, one way of challenging Hindu Rashtra from the domain of Hinduism, what is called Hinduism, is to say, and I see people like Shashi Tharoor doing it, there are others who say that I'm a Hindu, my Hinduism and the Hinduism I know is broad and inclusive, and you're making it, that is Hindu Rashtra, and Hindutva is making it into a very narrow project, exclusive project, and Hinduism is inclusive because look at the multiple things that are called Hinduism. I do come from there in the sense I'm not a believer, but I am a Hindu because these are identities we acquire, legal identities that we acquire at birth. So I did also argue like that. But gradually, as I became more exposed, of course, to Ambedkar's writings themselves, but also to the kinds of histories of what is now called Hinduism being written by and produced in different ways by Dalit Bahujan scholars, Dalit Bahujan people living their ordinary lives, Dalit Bahujan activists. I think in the last 10 years, my perspective has radically shifted because of being exposed to this kind of thinking. And I am now much more convinced that our argument against Hindu Rashtra has to start by challenging the very idea of Hinduism, which of course, Baba Sahib did. I mean, he did say there's no such thing as Hinduism, it's a collection of castes. But I feel building on that, we are able to see that the discourse of secularism, because it assumes something called religion, assumes something called Hinduism. So when the Hindu code bills were being enacted, when the acts came into place in 1955 to 56, that was the latest definition of Hindu. And the definition of Hindu is simply all those who are not Muslim, Christian, Sikh or Parsi. That's it. That is the definition, because there is no one concrete thing, like a common minimum, one small thing that would hold all these communities together. So that it, and the fact that this has been accepted, the fact that this has not been questioned by exemplary anti-Hindu Rashtra politicians, intellectuals, etc., is to me astonishing. It's astonishing to me that I took so long to understand. So it's not like I'm standing outside, and it's also a self-critique that so in what I say here is that Hindutva is of course the modern version, the new form that this project of assimilation has taken, and there's a huge body of scholarship which marks the break. But and I accept that there is a break. This is very different. It's a very modern project, a modern Western project. Hindu Rashtra is a modern Western project. It is not at all indigenous. It is not, because the very idea of a nation state is a very, very Western idea. So you have the break, but I was intrigued by the continuity. As I read more and more, I was intrigued by the continuity of the project, as I say, from the Puranas onwards, which sounds a bit crazy to say but it is a very, very long project, and it's a failed project. The thing is, the Puranas were a much more sophisticated project. Hindutva is very crass. And the project has been to mainstream and normalize Aryan, patriarchal, Brahminical modes of living, culture, values, norms over this large sets of multiple heterogeneous communities that were non-Brahminical, Dravidian, non-Aryan. So the Puranas give space by linking the existing origin myths, existing stories about themselves, by linking it to some hero or the other of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. And the idea is to give them the space. So what happens is that a lot of those kinds of communities then claim Hinduism. A lot of the communities don't. So the work on who the Asuras are, for example. So from that whole tribal belt, Mahishasura is worshipped of Central India, the whole tribal belt of Central India. Mahishasura is worshipped. Mahishasura is their king who was defeated by Brahminical forces. Now, so this had been happening in JNU when certain student groups had started doing the Mahishasura Puja in JNU, and I remember Smriti Irani in Parliament completely baffled by the idea that a group of people can worship a demon, because for their kind of Hinduism, it doesn't even occur to ask why are certain people demons and why are certain communities demons. And another example, I know when I read this, it blew my mind, was Kamal Bharti asking a very simple question. Why is it that when Ram and Lakshman, the young princes, are in exile, why are saint sadhus and sages continually calling on them to come and protect them in the forests from asuras who are raining unclean things on their yajna. So, this is what Ram and Lakshman go to protect sage after sage. And Kamal Bharti, who is an Ambedkarite intellectual, his question is, what are the sages doing in the forests? Why are they in the forest insisting on performing yajnas in a land of the asuras? So, this is your Kshatriya Brahmin expansion. So, I am using historical work, of which of course there is such a large body, but Upinder Singh's Political Violence in Ancient India was really formative for my understanding. So, it is not to read myths as if they are history, but to match the way, for example, C.D.D. Goswami did, or as Upinder herself does, is to match myths with what we know about history. So, one of the elements, I'm sorry, I'll keep speaking about this forever, so I can stop. For me, this was the most exciting part of the book, reading about the book. For example, you'll see how patrilineal primogeniture is established as a norm, so that anyone who challenges it is in and of herself, and I'm saying herself, a villain. Kaikeyi is a villain. So, the establishment of patrilineal primogeniture, which means that there were other ways of living. Draupadi's 5 husbands is obviously forms of polyandry were common, and today in Himachal Pradesh there are historians. Aniket Alam is one of the historians I am familiar with, whose work I am familiar with. It's not died out, the practice of polyandry. So, you can see polyandry, and what happens is, from our modern eye, it looks like further exploitation of the woman, but perhaps not. I mean, it's not as if having one husband is necessarily less exploitative. What is the form of that marriage is taking is the question you have to ask. So, polyandry is there, so it's not completely delegitimized, but there's an explanation given for it. Why? So, it has to be explained why Draupadi somehow has 5 husbands, because the mother said this, right? Kunti said this. So there's a way of reading these myths as, so primogeniture is one, the other in patrilineal primogeniture, the other you'll notice is the continuous delegitimizing of the maternal family. The villains are mamas, Shakuni, Kamsa. Kaikeyi's, the most evil person actually is Manthara, who has come with her from her home, from her natal home. So, that's a maternal, from the maternal side, the evil. So, this attempt to denigrate matrilineal connections is also something I found interesting. So, what I'm saying is that the Puranas were still a much more sophisticated project, and what we see now is the cruder version, the Amar Chitrakatha version of the Puranas in the Hindu Rashtra project. And the idea is to normalize that there is an 80% Hindu community here, whereas I would say now it's time to recognize we are a country of minorities, multiple minorities, and what will democracy look like then if we accept that this is a country of multiple minorities.
In your section on psychoanalysis and the creation of the self, you talk about how what is seen as secular is also seen as more scientific and therefore more legitimate. But you talk about how that reading can then choose to ignore things like profit motivations or power hierarchies and things like that. So, could you talk about that? Like, what is it that we're ignoring? What is it that is repressed in this idea of seeing the secular and the scientific as legitimate?
As far as psychoanalysis is concerned, as you know, there are 3 features that I think that the discourse of secularism obscures. It hyper-visibilizes religion and women. It obscures caste, which we just talked about. It obscures the non-individuated, non-rational self, particularly of the global south. It also obscures capitalism, but we can talk about that later. So, the psychoanalysis was, when I looked at psychoanalysis in the global south, out of sheer interest, it was much prior to my thinking of the book in this way. I've been reading and thinking about it for a while. What I noticed is that and a lot of it is inspired by the work that happened with the group of psychoanalysts in Ambedkar University, Delhi, who really established, I think, a field in the 10-15 years that they were allowed to function. It's now closed down. For all practical purposes, it's closed down. The way in which all universities are being attacked, AUD is under attack. I should just place that on record. So what I found is that unlike other disciplines that came with a modern body of knowledge, whether it's economics or political science or history, all of these came with a certain framework, came with a certain understanding of what history is, what economics is, etc., and it then gets applied and taught here in the ways in which it is. You would, if you studied political science in India, you would be studying it exactly the way political science is being studied in the US. Psychoanalysis is one discipline which comes here, but from the moment of its arrival, which is in the lifetime of Freud, it has the confidence in different parts of the global south to state that we're going to take this from you. So I think the ideas of the idea of the unconscious, the idea of the non-rational, sort of the self-transparent to itself, the questioning of that by Freud, these were ideas that were picked up with great excitement. But then the next step is to say, but you know what, it's not like that here. So my first introduction to it was through the work of Ashish Nandi, Sudhir Kakkar on India, and I realized about Girindra Shekhar Bose and so on. There's so much interesting and exciting work in India. And then I realized that that's the way in which it gets picked up in the Arab world. So in the Arab world, it is argued by, for example, Omnial Chakri looks at the way in which psychoanalysis enters there, and you find that it's being translated directly from German into Arabic. And the use of words, ilm al-nafs is how psychoanalysis is translated. So there's in other words, and they also draw a lot, the translators also draw a lot on sorry, I'm forgetting the name of, for a moment, it'll come back to me, Imam Ghazali. Drawn Imam Ghazali, who is, it's spiritual, Islamic, but they draw on that to build a psychoanalytic practice and a psychoanalytic intellect in the 20s in the Arab world, China, Japan, wherever you look. So I found it interesting that because in these societies that process of individuation that had when Freud is writing in the early 20th century, that process is kind of worked in Europe. It's completed. There's individuation, there are nuclear families, there are nuclear heterosexual mother, father, baby type of families. That's not the case in these societies. So what happens is that it just makes, so you know, in Japan you have someone writing, Kosawa writing to Freud and saying, we have a different kind of complex here, the Ajase complex, not the Oedipus complex, and that brings in elements of rebirth. So I found that, so to say it's not scientific and somehow Freud is more scientific, would, I think, miss. So these people are also in the global south are also much more open to non-scientific modes of healing, which would be faith practices, the idea of jinns, possession, and so on. So I find that that is all taken much more seriously in the global south. And they're all confidently writing to Freud and saying that's not how it is. Yeah, and Freud is like, hold on, you can't make such hasty generalizations, because obviously from the global south you can't. He can, sitting in Vienna.
Yeah. You mentioned your section on capitalism, so I think maybe we can talk about that next. You talk about how secularism is not just compatible with capitalism, but in fact sort of essential to it in the way that it allows for the commodification of nature and therefore the use of resources in an indiscriminate manner. The examples you give of the ways in which this has played out includes a section that I, in fact, had not thought about in this way, which was about the push for individual property rights for women. So if you could talk about that. And
yeah, so as far as capitalism is concerned, one element of how secularism is almost necessary for capitalism is because nature has to be made, has to be disenchanted, and so that's a whole kind of thing. I mean, that's a whole element and that's a whole strand of the argument. But the point that you're asking about individual property rights for women, again, this is something that I came to understand very slowly, because obviously as feminists we've always thought about and thought it was perfectly normal to demand individual property rights for women, but gradually even very left-oriented women's groups in the global south began to understand that individual rights to property, whether for men or for women, is actually a mode of pushing a wedge into community rights and collective rights to land, which stand in the way of capitalist acquisition of land for capitalism and for so I began to take this seriously as I came across, even for example in India, Aidwa makes a shift which is very fascinating, and this is actually what is exciting I think about feminist politics, is that feminist politics is always considers itself on shaky ground in a good way, that it's not as if we are absolutely clear about everything. There's always a way in which we say, we were wrong, we said that in the 80s, we were wrong. So so when I noticed that even Aidwa, which has actually stood for individual pattas in India, began to argue for community rights, and because they understood that this was a way of breaking up the community into individual families with usually a male head, even though you might get individual pattas to land. So what I realized gradually is that when I looked at the parliamentary debates on the 2005 amendment, which to the Hindu inheritance laws, which gave women right to ancestral property, you find in Parliament, and I've written about this, the most astonishingly patriarchal, misogynist statements being made. Astonishing only because eventually, otherwise not astonishing unfortunately, but astonishing only because after that whole debate, the rights up to land, individual rights to women are passed with absolutely no debate, with absolutely no voice abstaining. And then you find that in Rajya Sabha it's passed with almost no debate, hardly anybody is even present. And then you see that this is part of a push by the World Bank to insist on individual property rights. And then I realized, reading on a lot, there's a lot of scholarship now around all this. I understood that, for example, around the same time, the person who was visiting India and meeting the Prime Minister, who at that time was Dr. Manmohan Singh, and so on, and pushing this agenda is actually this Peruvian Hernando de Soto, who runs in Peru runs a think tank which is all about how to make capitalism work in the world, because while we may think that capitalism has succeeded and socialism has failed, apparently capitalism itself doesn't think it has succeeded. So Hernando de Soto's question is, why has capitalism failed? And it's failed, he says, because this idea that property, land, should be individualized and there should be individual rights to property is not universal. So we have to teach people how to do that. So this is clearly not a natural phenomenon at all. So we see the shift actually in India and all over South Africa. We see it all over, the understanding that the push for individual land rights to women. So once again, the bodies of women, the banner of women's rights is used to push some other agenda. So that's what's happening there. Of course, community rights are not in and of themselves democratic. There's caste, there's etc., all of that. But new ways of community rights we should be thinking about, new forms of community rights.
Yeah. Just to wrap up, I wanted to, so your book was written and published before the 2024 election, but there's a section in it that became, I think, even more relevant during and after it, which was that when you're talking about what happens when we say we go beyond secularism to try and define values that are meaningful to society, you talk about the power of constitutions to be a call for radical transformation. Now we saw this happen. I think we saw it play out in the elections this time, and how the push against the BJP's so-called plan to change the constitution really became a rallying point for other parties, and for even from the people from the ground. We saw a lot of that. What do you think it is about both the Indian constitution and the idea of constitutions that holds that power?
So once again, I mean, I have to confess that I did not, and not many of us thought of the Constitution as some radical document at all. In fact, there's a lot of work critical of what a small group, what a small limited group it was that actually sat in the Constituent Assembly, etc. But it's interesting to go back to the way we began this conversation. You're making that distinction between theory and practice, that it's the way in which the Constitution starts getting used, and it's not the Constitution overall, but the preamble starts getting used by movements from Pathalgadi, about which The Wire has had a lot of very interesting articles, so I won't go into that. But Pathalgadi uses PESA, the Panchayat Extension Act, it uses fundamental rights, it uses all of this, rights of communities. So Pathalgadi does that, and then of course the big push was with the CAA. And the anti-CAA movements and how they use the preamble. And that's also interesting. I would like to ask actually Mr. Mohan Bhagwat that how do you use the idea of secular when it comes to the civil code, and then let us, how is it that you exclude Muslims from, and how is that secular? So do you decide when to be, so that's a different matter. So when it starts getting used in a particular way, then one reads and thinks a lot more. And I think many of us who work in this field have started thinking about how the constitution. So Chile, I've written about Chile and its experiment at a new constitution. And I think, and what I argue is that in the global south, the constitution is not performing the function that it performed in the global north. Because in the global north, it comes at the end of a long period of unrest and it seals a particular order in place. What I think happens in the global south is that constitutions come at the end of usually some kind of anti-imperialist struggle, and then it's seen as the beginning of something. It's seen as a door to the future. It's a kind of porous, one foot in the future kind of document. Which is not to say that is the only radical mode. There are many, many democratic movements which would still maybe not use the constitution. But it is possible to use the constitution in this way because it's seen as a document of the future. And when you think of it as a document of the future, it's not closed. And in that sense, if you think about it, why is there a section called Directive Principles of State Policy? Why aren't they all fundamental rights? Because the idea is that this is a very heterogeneous group. This small group is so heterogeneous, the country is heterogeneous, and we'll figure out things as we go along. And perhaps I'd also just like to add that the continuous insistence that from the Hindu right that the Uniform Civil Code is in the Directive Principles, there are other very interesting points in the Directive Principles which include workers' rights, which include the right of workers to unions, etc. So don't just pick then on one thing. And I think the most important point that Dr. Ambedkar made about why the word secularism need not be in the preamble is, I think, for the reasons that I'm now saying, that secularism and secular doesn't mean one thing. It's not a substantive value. Because he said we don't need it because the values that secularism espouses are all over the constitution already. So then let's talk about the values. Why use the word secularism? Let's leave it to the Hindu right. Let them take it to use in this instrumental way. We are going to talk about democracy, heterogeneity, gender justice, social justice, and we are going to talk of these as the substantive values, and then we would be able to challenge every single principle of Hindu Rashtra.
Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been great.
Thank you so much. I've had a lot of fun. Thank you.